In this video, I present what I think are the 5 most important things to know about Roman slavery, especially when it comes to the context of the New Testament. We're going to start with number 5 and work our way down to number 1. We've seen this one before, but it bears repeating. Slavery was ubiquitous in and underpinned most structures of the Greco-Roman world. The Roman world really could not function without the institution of slavery, and this has been true for so many other empires, including the American Empire. Estimates are very, very difficult to make when it comes to numbers, and they vary widely. But most scholars would agree that at least 10% of the population of the Roman Empire in its heyday was enslaved. Estimates on the higher end go all the way up to 50%. Whatever the actual number is, and it's probably somewhere in between those, slavery was ubiquitous and it was very visible in the Roman Empire. Wherever you looked, there were enslaved people. This is because enslaved persons did much of the labor of the Roman Empire. On the one hand, enslaved persons were generally devalued. On the other hand, their labor was valued, and this labor varied in type. Some slaves were highly specialized and highly trained, like scribes and teachers, medical professionals, hairstylists, and estate managers. So there wasn't a direct connection or correlation between enslavement and low levels of education in the Roman Empire. One could be highly, highly educated and also be enslaved. Other enslaved persons performed more basic labor like cooking or laundering, doorkeeping, wet nursing, and messaging. These are not necessarily highly trained tasks, but they were the stuff of everyday life, the stuff that needed to happen for the Roman Empire to continue, for people to go on with their lives. And still other enslaved persons did those dangerous and difficult tasks of running the empire. Working in the quarries, doing construction, cleaning out the sewers, making bricks, rowing in the galleys, and fighting as gladiators for entertainment. These different kinds of tasks and different kinds of labor reflect the fact that there were also very different conditions and privileges for different kinds of enslaved persons. A highly trained enslaved scribe was more valued than a brickmaker because they were a greater and a more long-term investment for their enslaver. Number 4. People became enslaved a variety of ways. When manumitted, former slaves became freed persons. So enslavers acquired persons for slavery in a variety of different ways. The majority of enslaved persons were born into slavery. A child born to an enslaved mother belonged to the mother's enslaver no matter who the father was. Because enslavers had sexual rights over their slaves, an enslaved infant could be fathered by the enslaver. Another common way that persons became enslaved is through infant exposure. This is when an infant is born and left out or exposed somewhere. Someone who had the means to raise that child could do so and keep them as their own property. They might train them for a certain form of slavery or for certain kinds of tasks from their earliest years. And the idea, I suppose, is that slavery is better than death. Other enslaved persons were prisoners of war. The Roman Empire was highly militarized, and when it came to conquered peoples, it either killed them or took them captives. And captives then became enslaved. Again, the idea, I suppose, is that slavery is better than death. And so, especially as a result of Rome's militarization, there was a thriving slave trade. Slave trading itself could be an occupation. And so across the Roman Empire, and especially in urban centers, we have this thriving market and this thriving slave trade. Again, if you lived in the Roman Empire, and especially in a city, you were consistently face to face with the reality of slavery. Most people in the Roman world probably could not even imagine a world in which slavery was not a thing. It's equally difficult for us to understand the realities and complexities of slavery, and especially social relationships, given the cultural structure of enslavement in the Roman world. Slaves could become freed persons. This was more common for those slaves who performed specialized tasks, those who were specially trained, than it was for those who were doing the dangerous and difficult labor that the empire depended on. If a person was freed, they still were socially indebted to their former enslaver. In fact, they were called a freed person of so and so. So even in their name, they still had this connection to their former enslaver. One example of this complexity is up here on the screen, and it shows it's the funerary relief here in the top right. It's of a husband and a wife, so it's of their pictures with an explanation of who they are under them. The inscription tells us that she, the woman, was formerly enslaved by this man. He freed her and then he married her. This wouldn't have been incredibly common in the Roman world, but it also wouldn't have been unknown and gets at the complexity of enslavement and freeing and the relationship between someone who was formerly enslaved and someone who became free. Number 3, enslaved persons wrote many, if not most, of the texts of the New Testament. This one is a bit tricky. In the modern world, we like to think about a single literary author, a single genius standing behind a text. In reality, this is not actually how books, articles, or other forms of published writings are created or distributed today. The publication of a book, for instance, is really the labor of many, many, many different people, even if only one person is named on the cover. The same is true in the ancient world. Writing and publication were complex literary affairs that involved multiple people, multiple minds, and multiple hands and bodies. There were often many of these people were enslaved who were involved in this process. So when I say that enslaved persons wrote many of the texts of the New Testament, I'm not saying that many of the named authors, like Paul or John or Jude, are themselves enslaved persons. Rather, I'm saying that enslaved labor most likely had some role to play in the production and the circulation of New Testament texts. This is because of the specialized enslaved task of being a scribe. One of the main tasks of scribes was to be a copier in a context where there were not photocopiers. So, if you were somewhat well-to-do and you wanted to make multiple copies you made of a letter or some other kind of writing, you wouldn't make those copies yourself. That was enslaved work. So it varies from text to text, but certainly when it comes to the transmission of New Testament texts, copying them and passing them along in new manuscripts or new versions, enslaved labor had a role to play. It also very well may have had a role to play in the creation of text. That is, authors often collaborated with enslaved scribes to create new documents through a variety of means of composition, including things like transcription, dictation, and the writing up of a document from notes or outlines. While enslaved labor likely stands behind the transmission and creation of many New Testament texts, it also shows up in the texts themselves because the language of slavery permeates the New Testament. We have one text in the New Testament that's all about a single particular enslaved person. This is Paul's letter to the enslaver Philemon on behalf of the enslaved Onesimus. There are a variety of takes on what it is Paul's hoping to accomplish with this particular letter, but most scholars agree that Onesimus is an enslaved person, and Paul is strongly implying that Philemon takes some specific action with respect to Onesimus. Elsewhere in his letters, Paul uses the language of slavery, calling himself a slave, or in Greek, a doulos. Some English translations attempt to soften this language by translating it as servant, but there are no ifs, ands, and buts about it. Doulos means slave, an enslaved person, not a voluntary servant. Likewise, the word for Lord, kurios, the same one that translates the divine name from the Hebrew Bible, is master, as in the master in a master-slave relationship. While not every instance of the term kurios, or lord, or master directly implies this kind of relationship, it's always at least there under the surface in some way, if not so there explicitly. Likewise, the term boy was not just a way for white people to exert their racial power over black people in America's history. It's also been used in other cultures and contexts to do something very, very similar. So in the New Testament, we have examples of boy or child referring to a literal boy or a child, but also referring to an enslaved person. So the word pais in Greek can either mean boy as in a small boy, or it can mean boy as in a slave boy. And certain names in the New Testament also reflect naming conventions for enslaved persons. For example, a person named Third or Tertius sends his greetings in Romans chapter 16 as the person who wrote the letter. Naming slaves by their number was quite common, and so it's very likely that Tertius was an enslaved laborer. Whether he was enslaved by Paul or someone else is another question altogether. Finally, many of Jesus' parables use enslaved persons as object lessons. They rely on stereotypes and common assumptions about slave labor and the persons who did that kind of labor in the ancient world. That slavery is baked into the language of the New Testament, and the fact that it's complicated and simply part of the structure of the Roman world does not at all mean that it was a good or even a neutral thing. Different doesn't mean good or better. It's important to be very clear that slavery in the ancient world was different than American chattel slavery, but slavery in all its forms and slavery in all of its contexts is an abominable, violent institution. There's a tendency among some persons to downplay the evil of slavery in contexts that are not their own, as if being in a different context and being a different form of slavery meant that it was okay or better. I don't think this is a good way of thinking. Owning another human being, seeing them as one's property in any context is not a good thing, no matter how that enslaved person is treated, how they are educated, or how close their relationship with their enslaver might be. Slavery is always bad. It's always violent. It's always abominable, even when it shows up in our sacred texts.